The classroom was quiet and clean. The lights were soft and white. The air smelled like recycled oxygen and cleaning spray. Outside the large window, the stars were tiny, sharp points of light in the blackness of space. Ms. Lee Jun stood at the front of the room. She was a small woman with a calm face. She wore a simple gray jacket and dark pants. Her voice was soft and clear as she spoke to the students. "So we see that the Great Renunciation was not a moment of weakness," she said. "It was humanity's strongest choice. After we ended war and poverty on Earth, we decided we did not need a big central army. We chose to put our energy into talking, into art, into building a better society." She looked at the young faces in front of her. They were a mix of human students and a few from other planets. The alien students had skin in shades of blue and green. They listened carefully, their large eyes blinking. We became the galaxy's helpers, the diplomats, the teachers. We showed that a species does not have to be violent to be strong. She smiled a gentle smile. Our history of conflict became just that, history. A lesson we learned from, not a path we still walk. Kim Chul sat near the middle of the room. He was a boy with a thoughtful face. He tried to pay attention to Ms. Lee's words, but sometimes his mind wandered. He looked at the stars outside. The official story of the Great Renunciation always felt a little too perfect to him. In earlier classes, they had learned about the old days on Earth. They learned about world wars and terrible weapons. It was hard for him to believe that everyone just suddenly decided to be peaceful forever. He kept these thoughts to himself. Next to him, Park Mina took notes on her data pad. She believed every word Ms. Lee said. She thought the teacher was the smartest and kindest person on the station. To Mina, the story of humanity giving up its weapons was beautiful. It was the right thing to do. It was the only way to join the peaceful galactic community. In the back corner of the room, Kwon Yuna sat perfectly still. She did not take notes. Her hands were resting on the desk, near an old heavy data slate made of brass and worn metal. It looked out of place next to the thin, glowing screens the other students used. Yuna's eyes were not on the teacher. They moved around the room, from the door to the window, back to the door. She did not look scared, but she looked ready, like an animal listening for a sound no one else can hear. Ms. Lee continued her lesson. The galaxy saw that we were no threat. They welcomed us. Stations like this one, the Seoul Orbital Humanities and Diplomacy Institute, are proof of our new role. We are here to learn about others and to share our peaceful ways. Suddenly, a low rumble moved through the floor. The entire room shook. The lights flickered once, twice, and then turned a dim, ugly red. A loud, blaring alarm started screaming from the hallway. The sound was painfully sharp. Students jumped in their seats. A girl yelped in surprise. The alien students made clicking sounds of alarm. The calm, quiet mood of the classroom was shattered. What was that? Someone shouted. "Is it a drill?" asked another. Ms. Lee Jun's calm face tightened. Her eyes went to the door. "Everyone, stay calm," she said. But her voice had lost its softness. It was now firm and direct. Before she could say anything else, the sounds from the hallway changed. The alarm was still screaming, but now there were other sounds too. The loud zap of energy weapons, the crunch of metal being forced open, and screams, short, sharp screams of terror that were quickly cut off. The students froze. Their eyes were wide with fear. They looked at the classroom door. It was a strong metal door designed to seal in case of an emergency. A heavy thud hit the door from the outside. Then another. Something was trying to break in. Kim Chul felt his heart pounding in his chest. This was not a drill. The sounds of fighting were real. He looked at Ms. Lee. She was standing very straight, her hands at her sides clenched into fists. She did not look like a teacher anymore. She looked like a soldier waiting for a fight. Park Mina had dropped her data pad. She was holding onto the edge of her desk, her knuckles white. She looked at Ms. Lee, waiting for her to tell them everything was going to be okay. Kwon Yuna slowly moved her hands. She picked up the heavy brass data slate. She held it like a weapon. Her eyes were locked on the door. With a final terrible screech of tearing metal, the door broke. It did not open. It was ripped from its frame and fell inward with a crash that shook the room. Standing in the doorway were three huge figures. They were taller and broader than any human. They wore armor that looked like a bug's shell, dark green and shiny. Their helmets covered their faces, showing only dark visors. In their thick, gloved hands, they held large, menacing rifles that glowed with a dangerous green light. The lead soldier took a step into the classroom. His boots were heavy on the floor. He pointed his rifle at the group of terrified students. His voice came out through a speaker on his helmet. It was a harsh, grating sound. It was not a friendly voice. "This vessel is now property of the Cathar Imperium," the soldier snarled. "You are all prisoners. Comply or be disintegrated." The students were too scared to move. They were too scared to scream. They could only stare at the giant alien soldiers who had burst into their peaceful classroom. The lesson was over. Something else was beginning. The world stopped. The blaring red alarm, the panicked cries from the hallway, the smell of ozone from the broken door, it all faded into a dull hum. For a long, terrible second, the only thing that existed was the three armored giants and the cold green glow of their weapons. The lead Cathar soldier, Commander Vrax, took another step forward. The students flinched as one. He was immense, a wall of chitinous plating and pure menace. His helmeted head scanned the room, judging the cowering figures. "You," he growled, his voice like grinding rocks. He pointed a thick, armored finger at Park Mina. "Stand. Move to the center of the room now." Mina made a small, choked sound. Tears welled in her eyes. She was frozen, her body refusing to obey. The soldier took this as defiance. He took another heavy step towards her desk. Kim Chul's mind was screaming. Every instinct told him to do something, to stand up, to put himself between the soldier and Mina. But his body felt like stone. He saw the size of the alien, the power in its stance, the deadly purpose of that rifle. His own fist felt useless. It would be suicide. He felt a hot wave of shame, but his muscles remained locked. The other two soldiers moved into the room, their boots echoing. They began roughly pulling students from their chairs, shoving them towards the front. A boy named Lee Dayan cried out as he was thrown to the floor. The sound broke the silence, and a fresh wave of terror swept through the class. All of this happened in a handful of seconds, and through it all, every student's eyes, in their moments of sheer panic, flicked towards their teacher, Ms. Lee Jun. They looked to her for the answer. They expected her to step forward, to raise her hands in a peaceful gesture, to use her diplomatic words. They waited for her to say, "Please, there is no need for this. We are a school of peace." But she did not. She was not looking at the invaders. Her head was turned, her gaze sweeping over her students. She saw Kim Chul's internal struggle, his clenched fists and the shame on his face. She saw Park Mina's pure, petrified terror. Her eyes then moved to the back of the room, to Kwan Yuna. Yuna was not looking at the soldiers either. She was looking directly at Ms. Lee. Her gaze was intense, questioning. In her hands she still held the heavy brass data slate, her grip so tight her knuckles were pale. It was not the look of a scared student. It was the look of a soldier waiting for an order. Something passed between them in that look, a silent conversation, a question asked and an answer given. Ms. Lee's face, which had been a mask of tight fear, changed. The fear did not vanish, but it was pushed down, locked away. What replaced it was a profound and terrifying calm. It was the calm of deep water, of a settled decision. All the softness drained from her features, leaving behind lines of hard resolve. The Cathar soldier was now only 2 steps from Park Mina's desk. He reached out a gloved hand to grab her. Ms. Lee Jun moved. It was not a panicked movement. It was deliberate and precise. She took one smooth step to the side, placing herself between her desk and the approaching soldier. Her movement was so controlled it drew the attention of all 3 Cathar. Commander Vrax turned his helmeted head towards her. "Stay still, human," he barked. She ignored him. She placed her data pad down on the surface of her desk. She did it gently, carefully, as if she were putting a precious book back on a shelf. The action was so normal, so out of place, that it was more shocking than a scream. Then she looked at her students. Her gaze was no longer that of their gentle history teacher. It was the gaze of a commander. It was sharp and clear, and it demanded attention. "Very well," she said. Her voice was different. The soft, scholarly tone was gone. It was now flat, cold, and carried a razor's edge of absolute authority. It was a voice that was used to being obeyed. The soldier near Mina paused, confused by her tone. Ms. Lee's eyes swept across the room one last time, meeting the terrified faces of the children she was responsible for. Class dismissed. The 2 words hung in the air. They made no sense. They were a teacher's phrase, but spoken with the finality of a death sentence. For a moment, nothing happened. Commander Vrax let out a harsh, grating sound. It was a laugh. You think this is a game, human? Your class is over. You are our prisoners. He took a step towards her, his rifle rising. Ms. Lee did not look at him. Her right foot snapped out, kicking the solid metal leg of her teacher's desk. There was a sharp click. A hidden panel on the side of the desk, invisible a moment before, sprang open. Inside was not filled with data chips or books or teaching supplies. Lying in a recess of gray foam was a single object. It was a sword. The blade was long and slightly curved, made from a polished, non-reflective black metal that seemed to drink the light. The hilt was wrapped in simple, dark leather. It was a brutal, beautiful, and utterly primitive weapon. The Cathar soldier's laugh died in his throat. In one fluid, blindingly fast motion, Ms. Li Jun reached into the compartment, her fingers closing around the hilt. She drew the sword. It made a soft whispering sound as it left its resting place. She held it in a ready stance, the point angled slightly towards the lead soldier. The air around the black blade seemed to hum, to warp as if it were disturbing the very space around it. The gentle history teacher was gone. In her place stood a warrior, her eyes cold, her weapon drawn. The red alarm lights glinted off the dark, hungry metal of the sword. The lesson was over. The fight had begun. The silence in the classroom was absolute. It was a heavy, thick silence, broken only by the faint hum from the black sword in Ms. Lee's hand. The three Cathar soldiers were frozen, their rifles still pointed but their purpose momentarily forgotten. They stared at the primitive weapon. It was a thing of legend, of history. It had no place on a starship. Commander Vrax was the first to break. The surprise on his hidden face turned to scorn. He let out another harsh, grating laugh. "A blade?" he snarled. "You draw a piece of sharpened metal against plasma rifles? You humans are even more foolish than our report said. You have not evolved at all." He gestured with his weapon. "Disarm her. Take the blade as a trophy." The soldier closest to her, the one who had been reaching for Park Mina, took a confident step forward. He lowered his rifle, thinking to simply grab her. It was his last mistake. He never saw her move. One moment, Ms. Lee was standing by her desk, the sword held ready. The next, she was a blur of motion. She didn't run at him. She flowed. Her feet seemed to barely touch the floor. The soldier's hand was still outstretched. The black blade flashed through the air. It did not shine. It was a dark line that divided the space. There was a sound like a sharp sigh and then a heavier thud. The soldier stared, confused. His rifle and the hand that had been holding it tumbled to the floor. Greenish fluid sprayed from the cleanly severed stump. He made a gurgling sound of shock and pain before he even understood what had happened. The classroom erupted. The other soldier shouted and raised his rifle. The green glow at its tip brightened as he prepared to fire. Ms. Lee was already moving. She dropped low, spinning on the ball of her foot. The black sword swept in a horizontal arc. It met the barrel of the plasma rifle. There was no loud clang of metal. Instead, there was a violent crackle of energy. The green glow of the rifle flared and died. The end of the barrel, neatly sliced off, clattered to the ground. The soldier stared in disbelief at his broken weapon. This was not a fight. It was a demonstration, a lesson. Ms. Lee was not dueling them. She was dismantling them. Each movement was precise, economical, and utterly without waste. She was teaching them and her students a new kind of history. The history of the kill. Kim Chul watched, his mouth hanging open. The shame he had felt moments before was burned away by a surge of pure, hot adrenaline. He saw the teacher he had respected, the gentle woman who spoke of peace, move with a grace and deadliness he had only ever seen in historical combat files. This was not the great renunciation. This was something else, something older. He saw a fallen Cathar sidearm on the floor near the writhing soldier who had lost his hand. Without thinking, Kim Chul dove for it. The weapon was heavy and awkward in his grasp. He fumbled with it, his fingers finding a trigger-like lever. He pointed it at the soldier with the broken rifle and squeezed. A bolt of green energy, wild and unfocused, shot from the barrel. It missed the soldier completely and slammed into the wall, leaving a smoldering mark. But it was enough. It distracted the soldier for a crucial second. That was all Ms. Lee needed. She stepped inside the soldier's reach. Her left elbow snapped up and back, cracking hard into the side of his helmet. His head snapped to the side. As he staggered, the point of her black sword entered his chest where the armor plates met. It slid in with a terrible, soft sound. The soldier stiffened, then collapsed. Commander Vrax roared in fury. He brought his own rifle up, aiming directly at Ms. Lee's back. Die, primitive, he screamed. From the back of the room, a heavy brass object flew through the air. It spun end over end and connected with the side of Vrax's helmet with a solid, metallic bong. It was Quan Yuna's data slate. The impact wasn't enough to hurt him through his armor, but it was enough to make him flinch. His shot went wide, searing a hole in the ceiling. Yuna didn't hesitate. While the commander was distracted, she charged. She was not a large girl, but she moved with a feral speed. She didn't try to punch his armored body. As he turned towards her, she jumped, using a nearby chair as a springboard. She landed on his back, her legs wrapping around his torso. She drove the jagged, broken edge of her data slate into the narrow gap between his helmet and his shoulder armor. Vrax bellowed, more in surprise and anger than in pain. He reached back, trying to grab her, but she was like a spider monkey holding on tightly. This was the opening. Ms. Lee turned from the soldier she had just defeated. Her eyes met Kim Chol's. She gave a single, sharp nod towards the struggling commander. Kim Chol understood. He raised the alien pistol again, this time holding it with both hands. He didn't try to aim for the body. He aimed for the weapon. He fired. The plasma bolt hit the rifle in Vrax's hands. The weapon sparked and flew from his grip. Now he was disarmed. Ms. Lee Jun walked towards him. She was not running. Her steps were calm and measured. The black sword in her hand was steady. The hum it emitted was the only sound in the room now, besides Vrax's ragged breathing and the thud of his armored gloves as he tried to dislodge Yuna. He finally managed to grab her arm and throw her off. She landed hard on the floor but rolled immediately back to her feet, her eyes blazing. Vrax stood weaponless, facing the small human woman with the sword. He was bigger. He was stronger. He was clad in advanced armor. But for the first time, he felt fear. "Your first mistake," Ms. Lee said, her voice still that terrifying, calm monotone, "was believing our pacifism was weakness." She took another step. He took a step back. "Your last mistake," she continued, "was interrupting my lecture." She moved. It was so fast it was almost invisible. The black blade became a blur. It did not strike to kill him. It struck to disable. It sliced through the power conduits on the back of his legs. With a shower of sparks, his leg armor went dead, the servos freezing. He crashed to his knees, unable to stand. He looked up at her, his dark visor reflecting her impassive face. The sword rose for a final, precise strike. The immediate threat was over. The 3 Cathar soldiers were neutralized. One dead, one dying, their commander kneeling, helpless before her. The classroom was a wreck, smelling of ozone, burned metal, and something alien and coppery. The red light still flashed, painting the scene in pulses of bloody light. The students who had been huddled together slowly stood. They looked at their teacher, their rescuer, this stranger with a sword. They looked at Kim Chul holding the smoking alien gun. They looked at Quan Yuna breathing heavily, a cut on her lip, but standing proud and unbroken. The lesson was over. A new one had just begun. The classroom was a scene from a nightmare. The red alarm lights painted everything in a hellish glow. The air was thick with the smell of burned wiring and something else, a sharp, coppery scent that could only be alien blood. The bodies of the Cathar soldiers lay on the floor. The one without a hand had stopped moving. The one Ms. Lee had stabbed was still. Commander Vrax knelt, frozen, the point of the black sword resting lightly against his neck armor. For a moment, no one spoke. The students were in shock. They stared at their teacher, at the weapon in her hand, at the proof that everything they had been taught was a lie. The gentle history of peace was gone. In its place was this brutal, efficient violence. Ms. Lee Jun did not look at them. Her eyes were on the broken doorway, listening. The sounds of battle still echoed from elsewhere in the station. Distant plasma fire, more screams, the deep thud of explosions. She moved quickly. She reached down to the dead soldier and ripped a small device from his belt. It was a comms unit. She pressed a button on it and spoke into it, her voice low and clear. "All faculty, this is Instructor 9. Her words were a shock. Instructor 9? Who was that? "The school bell protocol is active. Secure the armories and defend the core. The children are in the hall." She let go of the button and turned to face her students. The calm, gentle Miss Lee was gone. The person who looked back at them had eyes like chips of flint. "This was Instructor 9. We cannot stay here," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the panic. "They will send more soldiers when this squad does not report. We need to move." Her gaze swept over them, assessing, calculating. She pointed at Kim Chul. Chul, you keep that sidearm. You are our rear guard. Watch our backs. She then pointed at Kwon Yuna. Yuna, you are with me at the front. Finally, she looked at Park Mina, who was still trembling, her face pale. Mina, I need you to be brave. Take this. She handed Mina the Cathar comms unit. Listen to it. Tell me if you hear anything about where they are, or where other people are. Can you do that? Mina looked at the device like it was a poisonous snake, but she saw the absolute trust in her teacher's eyes. She was not being asked to fight. She was being asked to help. She swallowed hard and nodded, taking the comms unit with shaking hands. The rest of you, stay close. Do what I say when I say it. Your survival depends on it. Let's go. She led them out of the ruined classroom and into the hallway. It was a scene of chaos. Smoke hung in the air. Panels were blown off the walls, sparking. A body in a station security uniform lay against a wall, unmoving. Ms. Lee moved like a ghost. She held the black sword low. Her head was on a swivel, her eyes constantly scanning. Yuna was right behind her, her own eyes sharp. The broken data slate still gripped in her hand like a club. They moved down the corridor. The sounds of fighting were louder here. They turned a corner and saw two Cathar soldiers trying to force open a sealed door. They had their backs to the hallway. Ms. Lee did not give an order. She just moved. She covered the distance in silence. The first soldier sensed something and started to turn. The black sword took him in the back of the neck in the gap between his helmet and armor. He crumpled without a sound. The second soldier turned, raising his rifle. Before he could fire, Kwon Yuna was there. She didn't scream or shout. She swung her heavy data slate in a short, hard arc, smashing it into the soldier's knee joint. There was a crunch of breaking machinery. The soldier grunted and stumbled. Ms. Lee's sword finished him. It was fast. It was brutal. It was survival. From behind the sealed door, they heard voices. Human voices. Hello? Is someone out there? We are friends, Ms. Lee said, her voice firm. We are clearing the hall. Can you open the door? After a moment, the door hissed open. Inside were 5 younger students huddled with a science teacher, Mr. Park. His eyes widened when he saw Ms. Lee, the sword in her hand, the bodies on the floor. June? What is going on? He stammered. The station is under invasion, she said simply. The Cathar. We are fighting back. Come with us if you want to live. They absorbed the new group. Ms. Lee gave short, sharp orders. She found a fire axe behind a broken panel and gave it to a tall, scared-looking boy. You are now point defense. Swing at anything that is not us. They moved on. A small, desperate train of survivors led by a woman with a sword. They encountered 2 more small groups of Cathar. Each time, Ms. Lee and her new makeshift squad dealt with them quickly. Kim Chul learned to aim his plasma pistol, his shots becoming less wild. Yuna was a fierce and silent fighter. The other students, inspired by their bravery, started to help, throwing things, creating noise, distracting the enemy. They were not just running anymore. They were a resistance. They were fighting back. The Cathar, who had expected to face unarmed, panicking civilians, were now being hunted in the corridors of their own conquest. Ms. Lee's goal became clear. She was leading them towards the secondary shuttle bay. It was smaller than the main bay, less likely to be heavily guarded. If they could reach it, they could get a shuttle. They could escape. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 minutes, they reached the large, reinforced doors of Shuttle Bay 4. The control panel was dark. It's lost power, Kim Chul said, his voice rough. We can force it, Ms. Lee said. She pointed to a manual release handle, hidden behind a protective cover. Yuna, Chul, help me. The 3 of them pulled on the heavy lever. With a groan of protesting metal, the large doors began to slide open just wide enough for a person to slip through. Inside, the bay was dark, lit only by emergency lights. But it was not empty. A group of 3 station security officers stood near a small personnel shuttle, their own weapons drawn. They looked battered but alive. They turned, aiming their rifles at the opening door, then lowered them when they saw it was humans. Thank God, one of them said. Survivors! Hurry, we can get you out on this shuttle. A wave of relief washed over the group of students. They started to hurry forward towards the promise of safety. It was at that moment that the main bay doors, the huge ones for the big ships, exploded inwards. The sound was deafening. A shockwave of force and heat threw everyone to the ground. Metal shrieked. When the smoke cleared, a new squad of Cathar soldiers stood in the opening. There were at least 10 of them. And leading them was a Cathar even bigger than Vrax. His armor was thicker, covered in spikes and battle scars. He carried a massive double-barreled plasma cannon. He stepped through the smoke, his heavy boots crunching on debris. He looked at the small group of humans, at the security officers and at Ms. Li Jun, who was already back on her feet, her black sword humming in her hand. His voice was deeper than Vrax's, filled with cold amusement. "A nest of little rats," he boomed. "And one with a sharp stick. How amusing." He raised his cannon, the twin barrels glowing with a hellish green light. "The game is over. Surrender now or be vaporized." They were trapped. The shuttle was behind them, their escape. But between them and it stood a small army of the galaxy's most brutal warriors. A massive Cathar commander stood in the ruined doorway, a giant of armor and menace. The twin barrels of his plasma cannon glowed, casting a sickly green light on the terrified faces of the students. The hope of escape that had bloomed just moments before was crushed. They were trapped in the shuttle bay, with death blocking the only way out. The security officers raised their rifles, but their hands were shaking. They knew their light weapons were useless against that cannon. One blast would turn them all to dust. Ms. Li Jun did not look at the cannon. She looked at the commander. She saw the arrogance in his stance, the casual confidence of absolute power. He believed he had already won. Her students were huddled behind her. Kim Chul had his pistol aimed, but he knew it was a toy against that monster. Quan Yuna stood poised, her broken data slate ready, a snarl on her lips. Park Mina clutched the comms unit, her face white with fear. The commander took a heavy step forward. "I will not ask again. Drop your weapons, or I will paint the walls with you." Ms. Li did not drop her sword. The hum of the black blade was the only answer. She slowly turned her head just enough to see her students. She saw not just fear in their eyes now. She saw determination. She saw a flicker of the same fire that burned in her. They were not the same students who had cowered in the classroom. They were survivors. She made a decision. It was not a decision to surrender. It was a decision to fight a different way. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and clear, meant for her students, not the enemy. "Chul, take the left flank. The storage crates. Yuna, the right side, behind the fuel conduit. Mina. Their comms array is on the lead soldier's left shoulder. Target it." The orders were simple, direct. They were not the orders of a teacher protecting children. They were the orders of a field commander deploying her troops. For a second, no one moved. Then Kim Chul moved. He didn't think. He obeyed. He dove to the left, scrambling behind a stack of heavy metal storage crates. Quan Yuna was already moving, a shadow slipping behind the thick, shielded conduit that fed fuel to the shuttles. The Cathar commander laughed. "You think hiding will save you?" He aimed his cannon at Ms. Li. "I will start with the one with the sword." As he focused on her, Park Mina, her hands trembling, raised the alien comms unit. She wasn't a soldier. She couldn't shoot, but she could listen, and she could follow an order. She saw the complex antenna and small lights on the shoulder of the lead soldier. She pointed a shaking finger. "His shoulder! The comms are on his left shoulder!" Her voice was a high, sharp cry in the tense silence. The commander hesitated, his head turning slightly towards the sound. That was the opening. From behind the crates, Kim Chul fired. He didn't aim for the thick armor. He aimed for the left shoulder of the lead soldier, just as Mina had said. The plasma bolt was not powerful, but it was accurate. It struck the comms unit. It sparked and died in a small puff of smoke. The commander roared in frustration. His link to the rest of his forces was gone. At the same moment, from the right, Quan Yuna did not throw her data slate. Instead, she shoved a heavy wrench she had found on the floor, skittering it across the ground towards the feet of the soldiers. It was a distraction, a small, clattering noise. The Cathar soldiers, confused by the loss of comms and the sudden movement, shifted their aim for a split second. They looked at Yuna, they looked at Chul, they took their eyes off Ms. Li. She became a storm. She did not charge the commander. She moved towards the regular soldiers on his flank. The black sword was a blur of darkness. She moved among them like a dancer. She was too fast, too close for them to use their rifles effectively. The humming blade sliced through rifle barrels, through armor joints, through limbs. It was a brutal, efficient harvest. The commander bellowed and fired his cannon. But Ms. Lee was no longer where she had been. The massive green blast tore a hole in the wall where she had been standing a second before. But now she was amidst his soldiers, using them as a shield. Kim Chul kept firing from his cover. Not to kill, but to harass, to force the soldiers to keep their heads down. Yuna threw pieces of debris, creating more noise and confusion. The Cathar were trained for a straight fight. They were not trained for this. They were not trained for an enemy who used their own arrogance and size against them. They were not trained for an enemy who fought as one mind, one unit. The commander, enraged, swung his cannon, trying to get a clear shot. But his own men were in the way. He watched in disbelief as the small human with the sword dismantled his squad one by one. Finally, only he was left. He stood alone, his cannon heavy in his hands. Ms. Lee Jun stood before him, her sword dripping with green fluid. Her chest was rising and falling slightly, but her eyes were still calm. Behind her, Kim Chul and Kwon Yuna stepped out from their cover, standing at her sides. They were not hiding anymore. The commander saw them. The boy with the scavenged pistol. The girl with the piece of metal. The woman with the ancient sword. They were nothing. They should have been nothing, but they had destroyed his entire squad. He let out a wordless roar of fury and raised his cannon for one last, desperate shot. He never finished the motion. Ms. Lee moved forward. The black sword flashed upward, then down in a savage arc. It struck the barrel of the massive cannon. There was a shriek of tearing metal and a violent explosion of contained plasma energy. The cannon blew apart in the commander's hands, throwing him backward against the wall. He slid to the floor, his armor scorched and broken, unmoving. Silence returned to the shuttle bay. It was over. The security officers rushed forward, herding the students towards the small personnel shuttle. The bay doors were opened. The students, scared and exhausted, hurried on board. Kim Chul, Park Mina, and Kwon Yuna stood at the ramp. They turned to look back at their teacher. Ms. Lee Jun stood watching the doorway, her black sword resting on her shoulder. She was not coming with them. She was staying to make sure they escaped. To hold the line. Kim Chul gave her a slow, firm nod. It was a salute. Park Mina looked at her with new eyes, no longer seeing just a teacher but a protector. Kwon Yuna stood straight, a look of fierce pride on her face. They boarded the shuttle. The hatch closed with a hiss. The engines whined to life and the small ship lifted off, maneuvering carefully through the blasted bay doors and out into the safety of open space. Ms. Lee watched it go. When it was a speck against the stars, she lifted the Cathar comms unit to her lips. Her voice was cold and clear, echoing slightly in the empty, ruined bay. Instructor 9 to all surviving staff. The lesson is over. The final exam has begun. She turned away from the stars, her sword humming softly in the dim light. She walked back towards the dark, invaded corridors of the station. She was not finished. She had more to teach the Cathar Imperium, and the lesson would be written in blood.